We're going to take a look at the sampler track in Cubase. It's a relatively recent addition to the Cubase list of features, but it has seen some small tweaks over the years, and most recently there's been some quite significant additions. Kind of takes the functionality up a notch. We're going to look here at using an audio loop. I've got this drum loop here. Now this is a straight audio section of audio. It just happens in this case that it's 102 beats per minute. You can see down here, and actually it's a 4-bar loop. So this is kind of unmanipulated, and it's an audio track. If I control or command click on the audio itself, and control command right click, I can choose create sampler track, and that will automatically take the audio that I've selected here and assign it to a sampler track. I'm going to mute that original audio now, and you can see here in the sampler track we get the keyboard down the bottom, and the various features, and the audio is presented in the main part of the window. If I click on the keyboard here, I can use the mouse to do this, and it will play the audio. Now I'm going to use the actual keyboard, my own MIDI keyboard, and it will highlight the notes down the bottom. And the most significant thing there is that the audio speeds up or slows down depending on where you play on the keyboard. So it's speeding up or slowing down the audio. That obviously changes the pitch, but it'll also change the tempo in this case. If I don't want it to change the tempo, I can use audio warp mode. And if I play up and down the keyboard, now it will essentially repitch it, but the tempo will remain the same. Now you do get some artifacts coming through from that because it's time stretching, and there are different modes available, a couple of music and solo modes that you can play around with. You can also synchronize the audio itself to the project tempo and speed it up and slow it down in relative terms. So that's kind of that's quite interesting, and obviously used for drum loops, but all kinds of other content as well. If we slip back now to normal mode, we get the options for different types of sample playback quality. Now this is standard. If I go to vintage, what I can then do is I can change the bit rate, the bit depth, sorry, and also the sample rate. I can reduce that. I can reduce it down to, say, 8,000, and this emulates to some extent the sound of older samplers, which had limited bit depth and also limited sample rate, and it means that the quality does change. And one of the tricks that used to be done with those samplers was, because they had such limited memory and therefore sampling time, is that records, vinyl, be played in at a much faster speed, and then the sample was pitched downwards to bring it back to normal speed. But it would obviously reduce the quality as well, and this can emulate those kinds of ways of doing things. So if you play back an album at 78, record it into the sampler, and then readjust the playback speed of it, you can actually fit more of a sample into the memory, but the quality will suffer in the process. And this tries to emulate that to a certain extent. Sometimes the results can be quite subtle, but it's certainly in relation to that kind of the late 80s or sort of latter stage of the 80s and early 90s kind of hip hop sound. This is very much part of the way in which samplers were cajoled into actually storing more of a sample, longer loops or more samples. So we have that, but also the other thing here is this slice mode, which I think which is really great. So you might be familiar with the hit point functionality in the sampler window, in the audio window, sorry, in Cubase, and essentially what it's looking for is transients. So these changes in dynamics, and it will slice up a piece of audio based on those. What we have here is this automatic hit point detection. We can play around with it, change the threshold, and actually kind of zoom in if we need to, and have a look at sort of some of the detail of where we want those slices to occur. And you can choose this similar kind of settings that you actually get in Cubase in the audio editor as well. You can change the sort of minimum length of these samples. These all have a bearing on where the hit points are actually will actually fall. So I put 200 milliseconds as the minimum length. Then it starts to space them out. You'll get this if you get lots of, if for some reason you're adjusting it and you get lots of spurious, smaller hit points in between where you think they should be, then changing that minimum length will be really, really helpful. But I'm going to bring this back to about 50, and you can notice you get more coming through there. And I'm going to play around with the threshold. Okay, so that looks kind of okay, and you can see if you can actually highlight different bits, and already you will find also that when if you keep an eye on the keyboard here, as I change the threshold, you will see the number of keys highlighted will change. Now I'm going to bring this back down a little bit there. Okay, so now I've got this number of keys, and what it does, it allocates a slice to each key on the keyboard. So what I can do is I can use this hit point functionality to, or slice functionality to, I can just load any audio into it, drag the, play around with the threshold slider, and it will automatically map those samples across the keyboard. Great for vocals and things like that, and interesting vocal effects, but you can, and all kinds of material. But obviously, most obviously used on drums as a way of playing around with those drum loops. After the fact, reprogramming them in effect. And the big thing here that really makes the difference is that if I drag this MIDI icon into the sampler playback window, what I then get, if we go back here, you can see, I'm going to double click into it, in the MIDI of this, you can see what it's doing is playing each of the individual hits. So what I've got here is, if I play it back, I've got the loop being played back as if it was the original loop, except the sampler track is triggering each of those individual events. And that means I can then do things where I can play around with the pitch, and it's adjusting the pitch of each of those elements. You can bring that down, which is obviously different to changing the pitch of a whole loop. But I can also, if I go into the amplitude modulation here, the amp envelope, I can change the length, I suppose, of each of those hits. They're much shorter and sharper. I can do the same thing with the filter as well. I can engage the filter. Let's push the resonance up a bit here. We get different types, so I'm going to keep it with tube and push the drive up. And we can even assign an LFO to the filter. In this case, LFO 1. We can sync it to tempo. You can see the note values there. Let's do it to halves there. So you can see there's quite a lot of ways you can just play around with a drum loop in a pretty sort of quick and effective way, just using the sampler track, filtering, adding drive to the filter, lots of different filter types, the amplitude envelope, the envelopes for filtering as well. There is a pitch envelope as well for playing around with that if you want to. These various different trigger modes as well. And the other thing, just coming back to what I was stressing before, I mean, this is obviously dealing with a drum loop, but you can load in vocals, you could load in even like sort of any bit of audio, bits of bass lines. You could bounce down a bass line, put it into the sampler track, and use the trigger mode to reorder it and do all kinds of interesting things, because you can then dip into the MIDI editor and play around with the notes. You can even quantize them in here. So if I wanted to quantize the audio, I could do that, quantize the audio, and it means that I can actually correct or tighten up the sound of the drum loops. Lots of different interesting creative options of what you can actually do within the sampler track, and certainly where we're at with now with the functionality, it really means that it is usable across a wide range of interesting bits of audio, and is a great creative option.